Thus says the Lord of hosts, the God of Israel, to all the exiles whom I have sent into exile from Jerusalem to Babylon. Build houses and live in them. Plant gardens and eat their produce. Take wives and have sons and daughters. Take wives for your sons and give your daughters in marriage, that they may bear sons and daughters. Multiply there and do not decrease. But seek the welfare of the city where I have sent you into exile, and pray to the Lord on its behalf, for in its welfare you will find your welfare. For Christians, Jeremiah's letter to the exiles sums up our commission. Seek the good of the city. To the dwellers in cities, as to all men and women, we are called to proclaim the good news of Jesus. It is also our challenge as citizens of his kingdom to love our neighbors as ourselves. But how do we begin to seek the good of the city?
Yes, I think as a starting point for ministry in the city, one needs to talk about the city first. What is it? What does it stand for? How does it function? Who runs it? For whom? The church likes to come in and start dropping leaflets on it, throwing gospel words all over the thing without any analysis, without any imagination, without any sensitivity to the sociology of the thing at all. We need to learn how these connections really function, what they are, how they function, who makes them function, who are those guys, those invisible power sources out there, who are those people, and so forth and so on.
De allí la importancia de que un líder tenga muy claro.
For this reason, it is very important that a leader have a clear idea of the direction in which he should push a community, and that he not think of a given community or neighborhood as only a small community in isolation, but rather as a part of a larger community. His work is to observe the whole, but to work with small effects on the small community.
Chicago is more than just a place. Like any city, it's not only a place, size, density, and heterogeneity, it's also a set of roles and functions. Cultural anthropologists describe cities as cultural, political, or economic. There are really many Chicagos. We have industrial Chicago, of course, commercial Chicago. In fact, as you look at the buildings behind me, it's been estimated there are about 50,000 cleaning ladies that work in those buildings just at night. So there is night Chicago. There is theater Chicago. And of course, you can see part of recreational Chicago. We've got many Chicagos. We have River City, we have the lakefront. All of this is part of the pluralism of the city that faces the church. Because the city is a set of systems, you could expect that behind this facade on the lakefront, there is another Chicago. Indeed, there is. There is a Chicago of wealth and power and privilege. In fact, WASP is not always white Anglo-Saxon Protestant. I usually call it wealthy, alienated, separated, and protected. But behind the facade on the lakefront is another Chicago on the river. That is a Chicago of poor and blue-collar ethnic people, factory workers, and some who are structured into poverty. The city brings the have and the have-not right next to each other. And that's one of the realities we'll have to deal with in ministry if we're going to address the city. The Bible has a great deal to say about justice and injustice. That's really what we're talking about here. 400 passages or so in the Bible about the poor, and about 70 of them that say, see to it that the poor get justice. The city is like a giant magnet. It is attracting people from rural areas all over the world. And in many of those settings, there are produced slums. Oh, in the American city, the slum is in the old neighborhood. In the third world city, the slum will be on the edge of the city, a tacky little shanty town on a hill, a barrio or a favela, but the result is the same. The massive presence of the very, very poor who are locked into their poverty, in many cases by unjust systems that serve the needs of the rich, whose palatial buildings you see behind me.
Cities are composed of many complex connections. Connections with their surroundings, connections with their past, connections within themselves. But this complexity can be understood and put to work for the good of the city. In our day, one increasingly important function of the city has emerged. The city as a port of entry for huge, diverse, migrant or immigrant populations. Virtually every world-class city fulfills this international function with enormous consequences for life, and especially for ministry. Mexico City, for example, is considered to be the world's largest city. It has a population of over 18 million people, and it is growing by nearly 1 million people a year. Over half of this growth represents the birth rate. The balance is immigration from all 30 states in Mexico.
Cuando una población como la de México crece,
when a population like that of Mexico City grows over a period of 30 years and it triples, the demographic development outpaces the economic development, and it precludes any economic possibility to care for the needs of the population. Ground is very scarce and very costly. Poor people thus cannot buy land. This causes very grave problems of blight and slums, classic marginal areas, and neglected sectors in neighborhoods and precincts. What is created is a process of social decomposition, which translates into politicized attitudes toward the city.
Cities are like giant magnets attracting people. People are being pulled out of the rural area into the city. Approximately 20% of India lives in cities now. What this means is many people that we used to evangelize in the village are now here in the city. So we need new strategies to reach these people who are coming in. You know, I think, that many people from South India are moving to North India because that's where many of the jobs are. So that in Bombay and New Delhi, many of the churches that are being planted are South Indian churches in the territory of the Church of North India. You see, someone decided years ago that there should be a Church of South India and a Church of North India. But now the Lord is confusing us because the South is North and the North is South now, you see? So now we have the Church of North and South India in the North, the Church of North and South India in the South, and everybody else is in both places also.
What has happened in London really since the end of the war is quite a radical change in population. In East London particularly, there has first of all been a drop in the population as people have moved out to the more suburban areas. And at the same time, there has been a large influx of people from many, many different parts of the world. East London has always, well, in the last 100 years, had people from other countries, for instance, Chinese and West Indian seamen, and have been living here from as far back as certainly 1900. But since 1950, and really in the years between about 1955 and 1975, there was a major influx of people from particularly the Caribbean islands and from the South Asian subcontinent, from India, Pakistan and Bangladesh, and also some people from Cyprus, Greek and Turkish speaking people from Cyprus, who settled mainly in North London, and some Chinese-speaking people from Malaysia and from Hong Kong and Singapore.
La ciudad, por su composición,
the city, in its composition, is made up of those of us who have our roots in the city and those who came from elsewhere. The values and traditions form a very complex mosaic in which each group is different.
As well as serving as ports of entry, world-class cities are connected to the rest of the world through industry, transportation, technology, economics, communications, and politics. What happens in one city may be felt in another city, thousands of miles and perhaps several continents away. These interconnected cities become identified with their dominant roles. For instance, Boston plays a cultural role among cities. Brasilia and New Delhi fulfill an administrative function. Other cities such as Jerusalem, Rome, Soweto, or Berlin have symbolic significance. Some cities have multiple roles. London, for example, has political, cultural, and economic roles, both national and international. These national and international connections shape urban life in many ways, so that the city itself and every neighborhood or institution within it may be affected.
There's a great big factory near here called Tate & Lyle, which makes sugar. And when the local factory was in questions about should it go on, the workforce decided to go to Liverpool, which was its national headquarters, and arrived out there in coaches to discover that now the whole approach to sugarcane and sugar had gone to the British Parliament. So the workforce began to lobby the British MPs about this, to discover that the decision had gone to Europe, into Brussels, and power had moved from local to national to Europe. And there's a constant pursuit of power. And there's a limitation, I think, on the choices people have around here. They don't have the choices that other people have, and they don't have the power to do the things they'd want to do.
The Hyderabad airport was just declared an international airport. Just, I believe, this week. Is that true? That is going to make a difference. Up till now, Madras, Bombay, Delhi, and Calcutta were the international cities. In the future, I expect Hyderabad will be increasingly a multinational city with international business people and five-star hotels. And that will change the way the city functions. It will also bring people here who speak other languages and who will not attend the existing churches. How will you reach them?
Just as cities are connected with their surroundings, so they are connected to their pasts.
La historia que tenemos como pueblo mexicano.
Our history as a Mexican people is that we were conquered by Spanish colonialism. Work before the conquest was thought of as enriching. Work meant working for the community, for the nation, for the family, and for myself. But colonialism came along and twisted the concept of work. Work came to be thought of as something imposed, something forced on one and not as part of the culture. It was something that needed to be done for others. This generated the notion that work was the source of isolation and alienation. Thus, I speak of the city as a place of loneliness, where the individual lives alone, because now one only goes to the city in order to gain his resources and to satisfy one's necessities.
This is the face of Chicago, which began in this spot where the river meets the lake 150 years ago. It's a beautiful setting for a city. Behind me you see Lake Michigan, one of the 5 Great Lakes, in which 20% of the world's surface fresh water supply exists. You will see behind me a city of power with networks reaching commercially all over the world. To the north of us, the Iron Mountain Range was a place where you could bring the ore for steel. To the south of us came the coal, which would furnish the power for the steel mills. All that Chicago needed then was cheap labor, and it got its cheap labor from Europe. And this is a city that was built essentially by Europeans up until the First World War. After the First World War, it became a city of migrants. Large numbers of groups from the South came up to the city of Chicago. Blacks, Mexicans, American Indians began to come to the city and gave it its unique mix that it has even today. The Lord loves the city of Chicago. Chicago is the city of D.L. Moody. It is a city of enormous history.
Where you're sitting in West Ham, East London, 120 years ago was above the national average of church attendance. When they built the docks and industry came, it dropped to 1/3 of the national average and has been 1/3 ever since. And despite all the efforts by people like the Salvation Army that began just down the road and the Pentecostal movement that began in Britain at the East Ham Town Hall, we have never really reached the working class people. We have reached the articulate middle class people, but never the working class.
One thing that we have to realize when we look at a neighborhood is that it has a history, it has a life, and there are cycles that neighborhoods go through. In Chicago, a neighborhood may be in a very stable situation. It may have been that way for years and years, and then something happens to affect it and there's a change. Often that happens in a racial way. There's a racial change. And it is as though a whole new life cycle is beginning, and a whole new set of issues and set of problems are created because of that. And to understand the dynamics of that change, you have to understand the dynamics of the history and what brought that change about. Things like real estate interest, banking or financial institutions disinvesting in a neighborhood bring about all types of problems. And often the people who live in that neighborhood don't understand the dynamics and therefore can't come up with solutions. They can't understand why their house is in the situation that it is, why they can't get insurance, why they can't get proper banking relationships. So you need to understand the history. You need to understand how the systems look at a particular neighborhood. In my neighborhood, I pay twice as much money for my insurance as I would if I lived 3 blocks in another direction. And the history of that community and how institutions look at that community affect my life. They affect my pocketbook, and they affect the people around me.
What is your image of a city? What do you think about when you hear the word? Is it skyscrapers? Is it gigantic businesses? Is it harbors? Is it train stations, airports, conventions? Or is it even the noise that you're hearing and observing just now? Visual pollution of all kinds. What is your image? Actually, historically, there have been many images. The image of the wall, the image of the moat, the castle, or the cathedral in the medieval city. Here is a contemporary image of the city, the modern expressway, federally designed and funded, a power climate network of decision-making that brought a transportation system to the modern city. The expressway was certainly not built for the people who live here. They have been removed by this expressway. The expressway was done for those who need to come to the city, who've chosen to live elsewhere. When the Irish built this expressway, they intentionally designed it to run through the sanctuary of the church, a Polish Catholic church in Chicago. When the Poles heard about it, of course, they signed petitions all over this country, and they succeeded in bending an interstate expressway around the end of their church. This is the only known incidence of a church having enough power to bend an interstate expressway. And therein lies the intrigue not only of power, but of ethnic politics in the city.
Every city is a complex of connections with its surroundings and with its history. It is also a complex of connections within itself, a complex of systems.
A city is a set of systems, like the human body has a skeleton system, a neurological system, a circulatory system. A city has transportation systems. It has commercial systems. It has education systems. All of those systems make up the city.
It seems to me that one has to understand the connections in a city. The city is a locus of connections. Economics are connected to education. Education is radically connected to housing patterns and opportunities. And those are key connections. And the churches are radically affected in terms of either their growth, their location, their functioning, depending on the shifts in those relationships between economic institutions, the viability of educational institutions, and those often are affected just by housing patterns. And it's a kind of a circle. Where you work depends upon the education you've had, and where the kind of education you have depends upon where you've lived, which depends upon your economics, and you can go around that circle. And until somehow or other, for instance, so-called minorities can crack that circle and make a difference, unless they do, they are ghettoized, economically, educationally, and in terms of housing.
Hoy en día, en este país,
today in this country, no one thinks of urban development except as an expression of economic development. All cities are the finished product of a process of economic development. If that development is unbalanced, the city is unbalanced. If that development is planned, the city is planned. If there are injustices in the economic development, this is translated into enormous injustices in urban development and in permanent injustices in the society which lives in this urban environment.
For those who are just beginning ministry in a city, oftentimes the most difficult step is where to start. One place to begin is with the people who know the city. They are all around you, woven into the fabric of neighborhoods, businesses, schools, and community. The task is to search them out, listen to them, and finally learn from them.
Welcome to Humboldt Park, one of 77 community areas of Chicago. This one is very special. I'm standing here at the corner of Cortlandt and Fairfield in front of the church where I pastored for 10 years. This congregation was built by Swedish immigrants back in 1891. They came here, and in 1901 they began this building. When I came here to be their pastor, the community had tremendously changed, and it has never slowed down its rate of racial and linguistic change. When I entered this community, there were 30% perhaps Spanish, 30% Polish, and 30% Appalachian, and 10% everything else. What I want to talk to you about in a moment is, how do you enter a neighborhood like this? How do you find out what is happening, what is going on? How do you pastor a church so that the church can pastor the neighborhood? One of my immediate challenges was, how do you find out what's going on in a neighborhood as complex as this one? In fact, like every other pastor, I had to preach and teach and counsel and do church administration and run programs. On the other hand, unlike most pastors, because I was a total stranger to this kind of community with all of its racial and social and linguistic differences, I certainly had to find out what was going on. And that's when I decided I would try to network this community. Networking means just a strategy for community entry. And really, my strategy had 3 steps to it. I decided to take most of the first year of my pastorate and make 3 rounds of visits. The first round of visits was to the neighboring pastors. I went to 44 different pastors in this community, and I asked them a question. I wonder, I said, if you could tell me the most important lesson you've learned about being a minister in this area since you began. Now, I had pastors who were, first of all, very surprised that anybody would ask them such a question. But their second reaction was to be very helpful. I had one pastor take me to the police station nearby and introduce me to the police commander and say, here's the new reverend, treat him well. I had another pastor take me over to a school and introduce me to a school principal and talk to me about the basic problems affecting families in this neighborhood. The second round of visits was to social agencies. I went to the police commissioner in this area and found out what the pattern of arrests is for this community, what the problems affecting families are. I went to the social service agencies. I went to the courts. I went to the fire station. I went to every public and private agency I could find, again introducing myself as the new pastor of the church and asking their help. What could you tell me about life in this community? The third round of visits was to the businesses. I started with the little shops and factories you see around this neighborhood. I went also to the gas stations and to the little mom and pop stores. And again, I asked a variation of the same question. I'm the new minister. My church has been here since 1891, but I'm new and I need your help. I wonder if you could tell me how the community is changing. What's happening here? Now, all the time I was making these visits, I was taking notes. And I would say that at the end of that year, I knew this community about as well as anybody alive. I knew who was doing what, and when emergencies came, I was able to respond as pastor of this congregation in a more appropriate way.
If you're looking for information about a community, about a neighborhood, a newspaper or a magazine isn't the source. Neither is the University of Chicago and the latest study that they've just completed. The sources of information of what's happening in the community are found on street corners, are found with 70-year-old ladies who have lived there for 40 years, who may have experienced neighborhood change, or people who are down at the corner hanging out, because the community is a complicated fabric of people whose lives intertwine and weave together in different ways. And the informal ways of communication, people talking on the street corner, people meeting each other on a daily basis, or people working together on odd jobs, is the sources of information that is really in touch with the heartbeat of the neighborhood.
I start out by understanding the structures that exist in the city. You don't need to reinvent the wheel. If you have the League of Women Voters, if you have ARCO executives, if you have 192 social agencies, as this city has, there are all kinds of allies out there with whom you can meet and understand and from whom you can be taught. The crucial issue in my mind is that you go to those people, all of them with the same care, all of them with the same willingness to admire and see what it is they're doing and be positive about them and be taught by them. There is that structure, but so often what is the missing link is the person who's going to go there, to those people, care for them, listen to them, and relate them to other people. That weaving in and out that the church must do.
You've got to understand the interdependencies. You've got to understand the interrelatedness. You've got to understand that as soon as your end of the boat starts to sink, mine's going to go down too. We've got to understand that we're in this together. Whether we like it or not, we've got to learn to get along with one another. We've got to learn to listen to one another. We've got to learn to work together. That whole concept of listening and working together was so foreign to this city.
Networking is a strategy for entering a community. Through networking, one begins to learn the stories of a city's neighborhoods and people, of the systems which condition their lives. These stories will often provide valuable insight into the community.
I think it would be true to say that the gospel is known in Greater London to people who were born around the time of the 1914-18 war or before. As soon as you get further down the line, you get into a descending graph of the percentage of people who actually know what Christianity is all about. When you get to those who were born in and around the Second World War, you're getting to a watershed. And ever since that period, you're working with a majority of people who don't know and understand the gospel. So a girl went into a jeweler's recently. She saw a cross-shaped pendant that she really liked. She said to the jeweler, "I like that cross-shaped pendant, but what's a man doing on it?"
This is Chicago's newest hospital, St. Mary's. As you can see, it's rather modern. In fact, this story that I'm about to tell is so bizarre, you may find it difficult to believe. But nevertheless, it's true. I could teach an entire course in urban sociology with the data drawn from within a few square feet of where I'm standing. You see, during the Eisenhower years as president, it was decided to design federal legislation to upgrade urban hospitals. It was called the Hill-Burton Act, and it was part of HEW. As part of that, the old hospital, which is no longer existing in this community, got a grant from the federal government to build a new medical facility. Now, the local politicians knew that that grant was coming. This particular alderman in this ward, who was a leader in the Chicago City Council, along with some other co-conspirators, decided to get into the real estate business. And through a combination of redlining and secret land trusts and other conspiratorial tactics, they ended up owning and then subsequently burning in an arson for profit scheme much of this neighborhood. In fact, the ground on which I'm standing here was full of houses just a few years ago. There were 1,300 fires one year in this very neighborhood, 400 in one summer alone. The hospital was the catalyst, and a domino event ensued. The people who come in to work in that hospital often come with the attitude of, "Look what I'm doing for the poor." And they go out to find their car in that parking lot, which is a veritable armed camp. And they find their car is beat up, or they find their own purse grabbed, or worse, they find themselves attacked. And usually in the anger and frustration, the story is, well, how could they possibly do this? I mean, I've come here to help the poor. But like many urban pastors and church leaders and ministers and missionaries of all kinds who come into a neighborhood like this, they need to know that they themselves are symbols of the alienation and violence that has been done to the people in this community.
For example, I remember my assistant pastor of late, he went to see a family. And I was so touched when he gave me the whole story, how he found that family. There was a mother and 8 children in a small room. They are not our members, but they are creatures created by God, and they need to be cared for. They need to be showed love. And when he went there, he found that those children, they all sleep on cartons in that house. They don't have even a blanket to cover themselves. And some of the small children, those about 1 year, 2 years, and 3 years, they are put in a small room where there are goats, because where goats are at night, because of their breath, it becomes a little bit warm. And so they are kept there by the, the warmth of the breath of those goats. And that's their blanket.
The Latin family faces different kinds of struggles here in the city of Chicago, in the west side of the city of Chicago, such as, I believe that their main struggle is their language barrier. When they come to the United States, they have never been out of their country, where they speak Spanish and they know how to communicate, they know how to relate to other people. They live a very social life, communicating, and no problem at all. They come to the United States and they go out for jobs. Most of them have universities, many of them have universities, but because of their language barrier, they come here and the first things that they face is injustice treatment, and this brings down their morale, and this makes them go to jobs that they don't really like and they're not really prepared to do. And this is, I believe, one of the reasons why there's so many people in trouble and living poor. And it's because of the language barrier.
For instance, if I'm the pastor of an inner city congregation and my membership, particularly the men in my congregation, work for well, let's just say an automobile company. They belong to the union. I contend they need some understanding of why it's going to be increasingly difficult for them to get a job, why they're out of work. Their temptation is to think that it's because they didn't perform or whatever. And people do not need any more put-downs. My responsibility is to help my members understand that the real reason they're out of work is because management has decided to out-resource the product, which is a euphemism for sending it to Taiwan or Hong Kong or any place else in the world. They need to understand that the problem is automation. They need to understand that what really counts for corporations is the survival of the corporation. That might influence how this man thinks about himself. Or I might have members who are trying to figure out whether or not they ought to move with the company when it moves even to the suburbs. And I would say, well, you don't necessarily have to move. They say, well, but I've got a transportation problem. I used to be able to get on a bus, and it'll take me 30 minutes to get to work. There are no buses out there in the suburbs. I'll have to drive now. I don't have a car. Therefore, I've got a problem. And he's got a problem. There is a connection, therefore, between the viability of the neighborhood and the available transportation of that neighborhood, not just to get to the supermarket for a woman, but for a male, for instance, if he's head of the workforce in the family, to get to his job, which is now moved from the center way out to the suburb. If that transportation is not available, he's out of work. It's just that simple. It has nothing to do with whether or not he's a productive human being. He just doesn't have what it takes to get there. Or if he's just recently arrived, let's say from the deep south, as has been the case, or from overseas. There may be a bus out there, but if he can't read well enough to get on that bus and to make a transfer to another bus, if he can't negotiate the signs, he's going to be equally frustrated. So education, his ability to read, all of that figures in prominently in whether or not the man can get on a bus, make a couple of transfers, and still get to work.
For instance, one day I was taken to call on a rehabilitation center for abused children, marvelously run place called 5 Acres, residential treatment. And the young woman who was showing me around, she said, you know, a few years ago, the average age in this place was 10 years old. She said, now the average age is 4. Well, that set off inside of me a tremendous sense that we have got to put the spotlight on what is happening with child abuse in this city. I went to see one of the men in the police department. He said to me, the reporting of child abuse has gone up 500% in 2 years. Well, then you have to say to yourself, what is happening to families? Then you go to talk to the social agencies who know about families.
I feel that by my background being rural, and I'm in the urban area, it was a blessing. I believe that the Lord raised me up in a rural area just to plant me in this urban area, because I know what peace is. I know what harmony is. These kids do not know that. These kids don't know what a horse look like. They don't know what an animal look like in peace and content. If you see a dog or a cat and you see 5 kids, you'll find the kids trying to kill the cat, because they don't know what peace is. They only know what's destruction and death. And if you were to come in here any night, Glennion, in any given night, you would hear the gunshots going off like Vietnam in here, because there is a separation of souls.
I think it's important to admit to oneself, I'm afraid of an environment that is different than something I'm used to. I remember when I was a kid, I went on my first camping trip with the Boy Scouts. And I was familiar with the sirens at night and the gunshots in my city and the parties. It was a very familiar sound. It wasn't anything that really frightened me, because I knew that was my environment. But you know, when I went out to the forest and heard an owl, I got frightened. I was so scared because I was out of my element. Here late at night in this tree, I heard this owl hooting away, and it frightened me. And for the rest of the night, I couldn't sleep. And I think about a person coming into the city. It's important to admit your fears. It's important to say, I'm afraid of an environment that is so different than anything I've ever had a part of being, or being a part of. So to admit one's own fear.
Kings Villages is the most contested development center for low-cost housing in our city. It's known more crime, more arrests, more tragedy, more fear than any other area in the city. Houses about 300 people. I found myself sitting in the recreation room, invited in, the Office for Creative Connections, while they were discussing creative next steps for the city. What to do for childcare, what to do for 12-year-old prostitutes, what to do for recreation that people needed, all kinds of things. I found myself trusted in the middle of that. I had some information they needed. They gave me some information I needed. It made me realize that you build enormous confidence by going out to listen to people. Then they turn to you and begin to discuss issues with you, and you have a fresh way of approaching the life of a city on the level of issues, because you've built a network of trust in you and in each other, out of which I believe those issues will be handled in a brand new way.
We're living in London in the middle of a hotbed of religious activity. We're in the middle of a war where London has been called the occult capital of the world, and occultism is rife, where the cults are all very, very active indeed, and where we've got the battle of the big three going on: Islam, Hinduism, and Christianity. And I'm not sure that Christianity is winning. I believe that the Muslims have got their noses ahead. Their major public rallies are drawing thousands of people. Their literature is aggressive and strong and confident, and they sense they're going to take London by the year 2000. Now, I believe Christianity is going to have to wake up, and Christians are going to have to work and cooperate together if we're going to avert the threat that we face in this major city.
Claro, para tener una visión.
Clearly, in order to have a clear vision of the great problems, the person who is trying to analyze them or who tries to organize a community ought to be aware of 4 basic things: the history of the city, a geographic vision that is very clear of the urban area, a political vision of the behavior of the community, and an economic sense of what is happening. Without these components, there is no such thing as a clear vision of the direction that a people or a community is taking, nor of what its problems may be. to attack its problems in depth, attack its cause, and not just attempt to deal only with the resulting problem. The important thing is to arrive at and try to put an end to the problem. But in a city, the problems are structural at heart, and not just simply a matter of form. Although many times social justice in a society allows one to get to the heart of problems through the forms in which they present themselves. The most important thing in order to have this vision is to be open to information and communication. Information in all its forms. Communication with all levels of the citizens of the city.
Networking the connections in a city will bring an understanding of the city's complexity. But those who seek the good of the city will still be left with the question of where to plug in, to break in, to begin.
The city of Chicago is a hard thing to get your arms around. It's hard to understand a whole city. In fact, it's really hard to understand even a community. I have learned that the city is made up of many, many small neighborhoods. Maybe only 3 or 4 blocks. That neighborhood may be very, very different from the neighborhood right next door, across the tracks, or across a main boulevard. We often think of a community as a homogeneous unit, but it isn't. It is a gathering place of different ideas, different groupings of people, people who have a variety of problems, a middle-class community right next door to a poor community. And we need to understand those dynamics if we're going to minister in the community. We found in our community of Austin that we've got people whose values and interests are in the housing stock and increased property values. And 2 blocks away, we've got a radical group that's interested in low-income housing for the poor and family groups. Well, if you're going to minister in that neighborhood, you better understand the dynamics that are going on with such things.
Neighborhoods is so obvious. We take them so for granted. That the neighborhood, the community, is the point at which the tire hits the road, at which every single service is delivered, at which every essence of life gets transacted. And then when you come down to it, you say, hey, if the family is the support system for the individual, nobody argues that. You've got to recognize that the neighborhood is a support system for the family. We are products of where we grow up. Our neighborhood determines what we believe, what opportunities we have, what our aspirations are, what access we have. And that if we don't think as of neighborhood as a complex web of the micro complexity of the macro picture, we're missed the fundamental understanding about how the world works.
As we have seen, cities are complex. They are connected both with their surrounding area and the larger world. They are also connected to their past. Together, these connections affect the set of changing systems which is the city and the life of the people of the city. Understanding this complexity through networking is the beginning of seeking the good of the city.